Now, last time I was talking about these speeches that had to do mostly with American foreign policy. And I wanted very much to go back to them just very briefly to say something that was alluded to in the outline for that class on Tuesday. Every one of these speeches tries to move from what I would call partiality or individuality to universality. That is, it tries to move from the situation of a person or an individual nation, or in the case of West Berlin, part of a city, to a much wider frame of reference. In many cases, it's as wide as what these individuals giving the speeches are declaring to be the free world, or democracies everywhere. And so, without looking at these addresses, I just wanted to remind you of some of the ways in which that's done in these speeches. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson talks about the ships and people of other neutral and friendly nations. He then also says, in a very famous sentence, the world must be made safe for democracy. It's an astonishing claim, but that is the claim in that address. The world must be made safe for democracy. And we talked last time, too, about the difficulty of any one nation trying to do that. Places a terrible burden on that nation, and perhaps that nation will overstep its bounds in doing so. Or get into a situation in which it has overextended itself, and arguably that has happened to the United States. When that has happened, very often a certain word is invoked about that situation. It begins with a Q, and that word is quagmire, yes. We're in a quagmire. It was used about Vietnam. It was used about Iraq. It's been used about a number of other situations. So there are risks involved with this. And there are possible mistakes that can be made. But that is Wilson. And then you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt talking about the democratic way of life. And he doesn't just mean in the United States. He means countries everywhere. He also talks about resisting aggression and thereby keeping war away from our hemisphere. In other words, the entire Western Hemisphere. Now, we're doing a little U.S. history in this course, so what is the doctrine that was established in the early 19th century that basically said, the Monroe Doctrine, named after Monroe, James Monroe, president. And what was the Monroe Doctrine, Vinny? Can you enlighten us a little?
The Monroe Doctrine was essentially, you stay out of our backyard and we'll stay out of your backyard, referring to the European powers?
Yes. We didn't always stay out of their backyard in the end. And sometimes we got in the backyard of some other countries in the Western Hemisphere as well. I would say that. But it was a doctrine which essentially was saying, and it has to do with what is called sphere of influence. So, for example, in the days of the Soviet Union had a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And when they rolled tanks into Hungary, the United States didn't roll tanks at them because it would have been an imprudent move. But every one of these addresses tries to move to something larger. An enduring peace cannot be bought at the cost of other people's freedom. So in other words, it's not just people in the United States that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is talking about. He's talking, as he says in the Four Freedoms, everywhere in the world, everywhere in the world, everywhere in the world, anywhere in the world. It's a nice rhetorical move in that fourth one to change it to anywhere. And that's his message. It is a message which is allied with what the United Nations would then call universal human rights. And of course, when John Kennedy gives his talk, he says, it's not just for you in Berlin, it's for my fellow countrymen many miles away on the other side of the Atlantic. What is true of this city is true of Germany. And by extension, what is true of Germany is true of Europe. What is true of Europe is true of the world. That's the move. Now, I'm not defending it geopolitically. It's not a course in international relations here. That's debatable about whether it's the right move or not. And some people would say, no, that isn't the right move. You have to be more cautious than that. But don't forget that every one of these addresses are being given at a time of crisis. Beginning of World War I for the United States, in a war that's already underway. In a war that's already underway, World War II, and Roosevelt is trying to help what he regards as friendly nations in Europe. And then for Kennedy, the crisis of the building of the Berlin Wall and the division of the city, when Berlin had already suffered this blockade in 1948, which was really just about, a little more than a dozen years before the erection of the Berlin Wall. So that's what I meant on that outline by moving from partiality or individuality to universality. Now, this is in a big playing field. It's with countries and wars and nations. But the same principle applies when you are talking to a smaller group of people about something that you want them to participate in. You need to move from your individual position or the position of the group you represent, your faction, as it were, to a position where you get all of your audience and others listening to come along, as many of them as possible. In other words, this shift from partiality to solidarity, if we could call it that, solidarity in the name of what movement? Important movement, just at about the time of the... Yes?
Solidarity was like a workers' anti-communist movement led by
Lech Walesa? In what country?
Poland.
Poland, yes, you said Poland, yes, but I want to make sure everyone heard it, yes. So you try to move from a position which is perhaps even potentially isolated or small to a position in which you are gathering as many people as you can. This is what any movement does. And we're going to take a look today at a couple of other speeches that deal with movements of people. I asked you to read also an address about the Tiananmen massacre. And if you have in our own words with you, could you pull that out, please? I think it's on page 385, is it? So this address is delivered 1990. It's quite a long time ago. It's in the wake of what happened in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in late 1989. It's given by Shen Tong, and he is talking at the beginning about the desirability of a movement that is nonviolent. And he is invoking Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi in doing this. He has a fairly long introduction, but he wants to establish his own person and his own experience in the introduction. He was there. He was a witness. He saw these things. And then at the top of 386, he has been listing some of the individuals who gave him this inheritance of nonviolent direct action. Martin Luther King Jr. at the very top of 386, he says, Albert Einstein. I think he doesn't mean Albert Einstein. I think he means, anybody guess, Albert, famous nonviolent doctor? Schweitzer, yes, you got it. Very good, Albert Schweitzer. So this is a misprint. I don't know what editor did this, or maybe it was his own mistake, but it's Albert Schweitzer and Gandhi. This inspiration, he says, was very pure and very idealistic. Then he goes into a narration, and his narration essentially makes the claim that the then communist government of China was simply a same kind of government that the emperors and warlords had always been, just in another guise. And that the movement that was represented in Tiananmen Square was a second step towards nonviolence as we move closer to the spring demonstrations. This is a narration, it's a context. And then the confirmation, the main argument, it seems to me, comes a little farther down that page with the universal truth. And there's that word universal again, for Chinese people, is that government comes from the barrel of a gun. Now, whether you believe that claim or not, he's saying this in part because of what happened in Tiananmen Square. First of all, we came to the conclusion that individualism, the self-awareness which recognizes the value of every human life, this individualism was the only way for the Chinese to break out of the dynastic cycle. And I feel that these two are the same thing, nonviolence and individualism. Well, the move here is very similar that he's making. He's trying to make a move from the particular and individual to the universal. And he's essentially saying this has never really happened in this way before in China. That's his view. And so he wants it to happen. And so much of the rest of the address is essentially a kind of question and plea for help in part. How can this nonviolence and this individualism come to some reality, to some practical skill or method in social revolution? It is still a question for the Chinese. How, he repeats again, it is a time for us really to learn and practice the principle, to learn from the examples of struggles like yours. Now, he says that because he's speaking at a conference that was honoring Martin Luther King Jr. So his move is very much so the same, only now this is someone not from the United States talking about US foreign policy. This is from someone from another country talking about what has gone on in his country. And then later on in the address, he paints a fairly vivid picture of what actually happened at Tiananmen Square, where a number of people were killed. Then, in the very last part of the speech, his peroration, he turns to Dr. King's words again, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And that's the logic behind this move from individualism to universality. If you're going to believe in something like universal human rights, if you're going to believe in something like a democratic government, whatever form it may take, you're going to have to work for it. There are people and forces that don't want it to happen. And in order to work for it, you will have to try to find a way to effect it. You will have to try to get as many people on your side as you possibly can. And here he has held up the ideal of nonviolence. We must learn from each other. All our communities must learn peace from each other. And that becomes a mutuality. In other words, it's just not a one-way street. And this is really building more solidarity. Please help China and the Chinese people. So, now we'll see this also in speeches we'll look at today, but on a somewhat different scale, on a scale that has to do more with women's rights and the rights of labor, of people who work for a living. What is the aim of all of this in terms of practice? It's to gain some kind of wisdom and judgment about what is possible to make change. We all talk about making the world better. Did you hear President Bakow's inaugural address last Friday? Yes. He talked about Harvard trying to make the world better. It's a high ideal, it's an important ideal. How do you do that? You just don't go out and declare what other people should do. What are the chances that they will do that? Harvard says we should do X. How convincing do you think that will be? Maybe not go down so well some places. Of course not. Of course not. We talked earlier this year about even the suspicion of expertise. People are not always convinced by expertise, whether it has to do with scientific issues or whether it has to do with health issues and so forth. So it's not enough just to say, here's what you should do, or here are the facts, or let's have a debate about it. You really need to try in an honest and sincere way to put the case forward in a persuasive manner. And that's difficult, that's hard. But there are certain times or moments when you have an opening to do this. And sometimes that opening involves a tragedy or a terrible event. So let us look now at one of the addresses that I put on this next unit. And even if you haven't read it yet, that's fine. It's an extremely short address. And that is on page 33 of In Our Own Words. Everyone have that? This is page 33. Does anyone recall a terrible industrial workers' accident that happened a few years ago in Bangladesh? Noor, could you describe that as much as your memory can pull that up?
I remember some of the female workers complained to the company that they were working for that they saw bad conditions in the warehouse, but they were ignored. And subsequently, after, I think the whole warehouse, just got destroyed and many passed away.
Collapsed.
Yeah.
It collapsed. It was a 6-story factory for clothing. And the people working in it, as so often around the world, were women working to make clothing. Probably have all gone to department stores and seen the labels made in Bangladesh or made in the Philippines or made in China or whatever. Well, the conditions in Bangladesh were pretty bad in this particular factory. It was about 5 or 6 stories tall. There were cracks in the walls, as I recall. There were warnings about it. How many times do we have to have tragedies when we've already had warnings about them before? It happens. So many of those girls and women died in the collapse of that factory. Something similar happened in New York City. And this is what Rouz Šneidermан is talking about. It was a terrible incident in the history of US labor and in the history of the country. It was called the Triangle Waist Shirt Fire. And it occurred in New York City. All these women were in large rooms at sewing machines, making clothing, and a fire started, and they couldn't get out. Why couldn't they get out?
The doors were locked.
Yeah, the doors were locked. Now, why would anyone lock the doors? So they wouldn't leave work, so they wouldn't duck out, so they wouldn't go talk outside or smoke or get a breath of fresh air. Now, this has happened in other situations of fire tragedies. It happened in Boston during World War II, I think the famous Coconut Grove fire in which hundreds of people died. But that was a nightclub. They were there for enjoyment. Or the recent fire in Rhode Island where about 100 people died in a nightclub because they couldn't get out. Some of the exit doors were blocked. But in this case, these people were working to make a profit for someone else. And they died. They were burned alive or they suffocated. And there had been warnings about this. These working conditions were intolerable. It wasn't right. Now all these women and girls burned to death. And so let's take a look at what Šneidermан says. Let's analyze this in terms of its rhetorical moves. It's very short. I would be a traitor to those poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. So is this an if-then statement? Couldn't you call it an if-then statement? Yeah, Kelly, how would you rephrase it?
If I came here to talk good fellowship, then I would be a traitor to these poor burned
Yes, exactly, of course. It's just reversing the clauses. But it's good to recognize that. So it's an if-then statement. Could you say it's an enthymeme? Could you construct a syllogism out of this? Anyone? Want to give that a try?
It could just be the if-then statement. So if I came here in good fellowship, then I'd be a traitor. The next premise being I came here in good fellowship, therefore I'm a traitor. Or like in the case of the
Yes, but she isn't.
Yeah,
she's
I
saying
didn't
she
come
isn't.
here.
So give us the form in which she would agree with.
You could have the premise I did not come here to talk good fellowship, therefore I'm not a traitor to those poor burned bodies.
Yes. Yes, I mean, you could put it in 3 separate statements, you really could, but it's an enthymeme. This if-then statement is basically an enthymeme. If I talk good fellowship, I would be a traitor. I'm not going to talk good fellowship. Therefore, I'm not a traitor. And by traitor, she means here a traitor to the dead and a traitor to their cause. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. So now she's turning to the public. What does the public have to do with this? I mean, this factory is owned by a private company.
Well, the public has voters, and voters can have a government that has regulations.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a democracy. The people are supposed to be able to have a say in policy and the enforcement of policy. Saying maybe just basic fire regulations. How about that? Where were the fire codes? There were warnings. What about the inspectors? Well, what's going on? Were people paid off? Who knows? Was this corruption? Who knows? but the public did not exert enough pressure to cause a reform in the system.